Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Mythology. This is part 1 of Module 3, where we will be looking at our first pair of gods. Many of the deities we'll be looking at during the course are paired up because either they are directly connected or have some kind of important relationship. So in this module, we'll be looking at Zeus and Hera and some related issues coming out of their respective stories. Just to review briefly what we've already covered so far, we've talked a little bit about the concept of myth as a sacred story that is often meant to communicate social and cultural values. I've emphasized the idea that we shouldn't be too focused on factuality in terms of did these stories actually occur, but what do they mean? What do they mean to the storytellers, to the audiences, and what have they meant over the course of time? Because these are stories that continue to be told and retold. And I think one of the take-home messages here is that myths gain their meaning in their particular context. And that context can change from the original historical setting in which the myth developed to its later reception. We've also started to talk a little bit about various models of theory and interpretation for mythology. This is something we'll be building on throughout the course. And in the last module specifically, we dealt with the notion of creation or origin stories. And these myths direct themselves to the basic question, why is there something rather than nothing? A very fundamental sort of question that any society asks itself. In this context, we looked specifically at Hesiod's theogony, which is very much a product of the early Greek world, especially of the so-called archaic period. And it's a very dark and often violent creation story. We saw how figures like Eros and Aphrodite, so these kind of sexual energies, were presented as primordial deities. But as the story played itself out, we have numerous examples of things like incest, murder, and cannibalism. We also saw how the story of Hesiod's theogony is one of cosmic regime change. There's a series of gods who come to power and then fall from power. So new gods killing old gods, new gods overthrowing previous gods. We also looked at one particular theoretical framework that was Malinowski's functionalism, which essentially boils down to the idea of myths providing a kind of charter for social values and relationships. So myths often seek to validate and justify the order of things and to explain why things are as they are. And I argued that a similar function can be seen in other mythological narratives of origins or creation, such as the early chapters of Genesis. So Grecian narratives reinforce a sense of cosmic coherence that itself provides a basis for the social order. Now, before we look at specific gods in today's lecture, I think we should spend some time thinking about the concept of a god in antiquity. How did the Greeks and Romans conceptualize what gods were? Because today we are very much influenced by the monotheistic conception of God that you see in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in particular, as well as some other traditions, where God is a kind of ultimate source of existence that transcends the universe and in some manner brought the universe into being. So there's a kind of idea of God as beyond all categories and concepts and as ultimately powerful. But what we need to recognize for the context of Greco-Roman culture is that gods, and we saw this in Hesiod, gods are part of the cosmic order. They are essentially fellow citizens of the cosmos. The only difference is that they are immortal and more powerful. They are, human-like in every way. They are depicted as having human form, so there's the anthropomorphic dimension to the Greco-Roman gods. They have human emotions, and they act accordingly. So the traditional polytheistic conception of a god in the Greco-Roman world isn't a transcendent deity. That does emerge later from the same cultural context, but in the sorts of stories we're talking about, the gods are part of the cosmic order, and certain gods are at the top of a hierarchy that rules that cosmic order. The gods also relate to human beings in a particular way. They have what we would call a patron-client relationship. And this is already something that is fundamental to Greco-Roman culture, that high status and powerful people in Greco-Roman society gathered around them a kind of network of individuals who were dependent on them. So the patron would offer the clients financial support, protection, employment, etc. The clients would then offer their loyalty and service and support them politically and try to further their agenda in society. So humanity relates to the various gods in this kind of patron-client model, but just on a larger scale. Also fundamental to ancient society is the notion of honor and shame, or honor and dishonor. This is a very kind of central dynamic in Greco-Roman culture, that the highest value that people place on themselves and on how they are perceived is maintaining their sense of honor or status in society. And sort of the worst thing that can happen is to be dishonored and to have one's status or perceived status diminished. And the same goes for the gods. They ought to be honored properly, and to dishonor their gods is seen as a serious transgression. The gods also were thought to have dwelling places. And often there are multiple dwelling places for individual gods. There's different shrines and temples in different locations. They also have a sort of profile. So each god has a particular set of characteristics and functions and jurisdictions and things they are responsible for. And sometimes these functions overlap with other gods, so they're not entirely clear-cut. We also need to recognize, and I mentioned this before, that, and we saw this a little bit in Hesiod's presentation of his origin story, that for many important deities, there are multiple versions of the stories told about them. And again, not any one is necessarily more correct than another. If there are multiple attestations of different versions of stories about Zeus or Aphrodite or Achilles or Heracles. That is simply a byproduct of the great wealth of mythological storytelling that adapted itself to different times and locations in the ancient world. So we can't get too caught up in the idea that there's one kind of singular narrative that perfectly encapsulates what a particular god is all about. Also, I should point out that the Greco-Roman pantheon was open-ended. There were certainly some gods that were more popular and well-known and famous than others, but there are lots of kind of lesser-known deities, and some of them we don't even fully understand today, and we only have a sense of their names. We don't have a well-developed idea of what their purpose was. So again, we should resist the idea that even though the kind of textbook approach, or when you look at these kind of popular handbooks of mythology, they give the impression that the Greco-Roman pantheon was essentially closed. It wasn't. The gods were constantly evolving and changing. New gods were being added, old gods disappeared. So it was a very dynamic process over the centuries. Now, the first specific deity that we will look at is Zeus. And we learned at least one of the versions of his origin story from Hesiod in the last module. Zeus comes to power by overthrowing his father Kronos, who had in turn overthrown his father to become kind of lord of the cosmos. So Zeus is on top of a hierarchy that includes the other deities as well as all of humanity. So even though we don't have, at least early on, a kind of monotheistic understanding of a supreme god, there is nonetheless a kind of hierarchy that places Zeus as king of the gods. And Zeus is the ultimate sort of father figure. In fact, when you look at Zeus's Latin name, so Jupiter, that's his Roman name, but in Latin it's Jupiter. And when you break that down, it's very similar to what you find in a lot of Greek texts when Zeus is invoked. The person will say Zou Pater, which means Father Zeus. So it's a sort of epithet or way of invoking Zeus as father. So this is ultimately the etymology behind the Roman name for Zeus, which is kind of Zeus father or Jupiter. We see similar deities attested in other mythological frameworks. So from South Asia, in Sanskrit texts, we have a figure, Deus Pitta, and all of these different names for Zeus are interrelated, just as the languages that talk about Zeus. We have Latin, Greek, Sanskrit. These are all ancient Indo-European languages that are part of the same language family. And so presumably there's some kind of original primordial deity that is behind Zeus and Jupiter and his other manifestations. So it seems likely that there was some kind of Indo-European sky god, storm god, god of sunlight and daylight. It's believed that the Indo-European root behind Zeus, Zo means something like shining. So there is a strong association with Zeus as god of the sky and light and storms. And he comes to be understood as not only the guardian of the cosmic order, at least as long as he rules, but as a deity that is responsible for what the Greeks called xenia, which means hospitality, friendship, oath-taking. So that is the kind of glue of personal relationships. Hospitality is a very important principle in ancient Greek culture. You see it certainly in the Homeric poems, how strangers are treated is the direct kind of purview of Zeus himself. And part of the thinking behind this is the fact that the gods often appear to human beings in Greek mythology, not as themselves, but disguised in human form. So when a stranger comes to your door, you're not sure if it's a god in disguise, so you better treat them with respect, lest you anger the god who is responsible for how strangers are treated. Also, as king of the gods, Zeus has a special interest in rulers, who he expects to exercise their power in a just fashion. But Zeus's power is not unlimited. He does have obligations to other gods. And as we'll see, it's not even clear that his rule is permanent. There are some questions in the mythological tradition that seem to suggest that his rule will someday come to an end. Also, Zeus isn't purely, benevolent and kind. This is another kind of perception that is drawn from the modern monotheistic or later monotheistic traditions where God is good and just and merciful, etc. Zeus is often cruel, and his decisions are often arbitrary and hard to understand. So we really have to put aside our sort of contemporary notion of God as a kind of supreme power that's supremely good. Someone like Zeus is very human in a lot of ways, and is certainly flawed in the way he exercises his power and handles himself. And I think it's fair to say that the ancients were often perplexed at the behavior of Zeus, and they had a multiplicity of understandings of him and his rule that sometimes seem paradoxical and even incompatible. So, for instance, if we look at a Greek tragedy by the playwright Aeschylus, who's one of the great dramatists from 5th century Athens. One of Aeschylus's famous plays is called the Agamemnon, which is focused on the return of the king that led the expedition to Troy. And if you're familiar at all with Greek plays, you know that one of the main sort of characters is the chorus, which is a group of singers that sort of represents the community perspective, and they often comment on the action as it unfolds. And they say at one point in the play, they chant, "For it was Zeus who set men on the path to wisdom, when he decreed the fixed law that suffering alone shall be their teacher. Even in sleep pain drips down through the heart as fear, all night is memory. We learn unwillingly from the high bench of the gods, by violence it seems grace comes. So this is drawn from the textbook on page 108. So for the chorus here, Zeus is really beyond understanding, and the way that he kind of exercises his divine will is through, making an example of people. So the importance of suffering and learning from suffering, this is a major theme in ancient Greek culture, especially in something like the tragedies, where the characters undergo sort of horrific levels of suffering, but that is a kind of path to divine knowledge through suffering, which is imposed by Zeus. The characters get some understanding of what the will of Zeus is. So again, this fits in with this theme of the kind of darkness and violence that is at the heart of Greek mythology, just as we already saw when we looked at Hesiod. Now Zeus has a consort, his wife and sister, because they are both children of Kronos, is Hera. And there's been some speculation that the etymology of her name is somehow connected to the notion of the air, or the kind of feminine version of the word for hero. It's not at all clear. But along with Zeus, they have a number of children, including other important gods like Hephaestus and Ares. And in her function as a Greek goddess, she is essentially the patron of marriage and childbirth. So she's a goddess very much of the domestic sphere. And when we look at the stories that are told about Zeus and Hera, she remains faithful to him, even though he fathers many children outside of the marriage. But this simply mirrors the practices of Greco-Roman society, where there was very much a double standard of sexual fidelity, and men were sort of freely able to have all manner of sexual relationships outside of marriage, where women were far more restricted to the household and the domestic sphere. So there's another example of mythology kind of mirroring society and vice versa. But as a result, Hera is often portrayed in Greek mythology as jealous and angry because of her husband's behavior. And we know that there was a localized cult dedicated to Hera near the city of Argos. And when I use the term cult here, I'm not using it in the kind of modern connotation of a, nefarious religious organization. When we talk about ancient cults or ancient cultic practices, this is a technical term for how the gods were venerated. So a cult, a form of veneration to Hera existed at Argos, where there appears to have been an important festival called the Hekatombaia, which was a mass cattle sacrifice. And in fact, in the imagery associated with Hera, cows are often a feature of that. We also know of a fertility festival in her honor that was celebrated on the island of Samos. And there her statue was apparently ceremonially bound to a tree and given offerings. So in different places, a deity like Hera, it can be venerated differently. There are different festivals associated with the same deity or a variant version of that deity, and maybe different stories are told to kind of explain the existence of these festivals. So that goes part of the way to accounting for the diversity that exists in the stories told about these particular gods. So it is possible that Hera was originally a kind of independent fertility goddess, and was only later associated as the consort of Zeus. And this is speculation, but this would make sense because even in Hesiod, I was arguing that when we see stories of gods overthrowing other gods, this could be some kind of distant echo of a migration process or a kind of cultural transformation that's happening on the ground. So as human beings move around and as they settle in new places and as different populations combine with one another, the myth stories they carry also get combined, and they also develop accordingly. Now, in the last module, when we were looking at Hesiod, I highlighted the figure of Prometheus as one of the more interesting figures from that poem, but there is also a play, also by Aeschylus, author of the Agamemnon, which we looked at earlier, where that tells the story of Prometheus, but includes an important commentary on the nature of Zeus and the kind of perception of his divine rule. So the play begins by depicting the god Prometheus as bound to a mountainside at the edge of the world in punishment. So remember, Prometheus was the one who gave the gift of fire to humanity and sort of was defiant of the will of Zeus. And in the play, Zeus is cast as a cruel authoritarian ruler. And in fact, the legitimacy of his rule is called into question. And the Prometheus Bound was first performed in 5th century Athens, where religious and political issues were being debated. Not long before, the Athenians had overthrown their authoritarian rulers, so there's a kind of active debate about tyranny versus democracy. The Greeks were also engaged in, resisting an invasion from the Persian Empire, and the Persian king was seen as a kind of ultimate despot that ruled over a population of slaves. This was the kind of Greek stereotype of the Persian Empire. So the play very much fits into a context in which the nature of authority is being openly questioned. That particular element comes to the forefront as the play unfolds. It was originally part of a trilogy, but the other two parts have been lost. Most ancient Greek tragedies were kind of 3-part narratives, and only some of them do we have all the parts. Now, towards the beginning of the play, we have a character that's sort of the personification of power, as Prometheus is being fastened to the mountainside. And Hephaestus is there. He's the craftsman god. He's doing the fastening. And power says, "After all, Hephaestus, it was your glowing flower fire, the power behind all works of hands. He stole it. He gave it away to human beings. That is his crime, and the gods demand he pay for it. He must submit to the tyranny of Zeus, and like it too. He'll learn he's got to give up feeling for humanity." So there's actually a lot kind of packed into this short passage. not only does power identify the specific crime committed by Prometheus in the eyes of Zeus as providing human beings with fire, which is here defined as the power behind all the works of hands. So again, it's a kind of symbol for technology and invention. It's a kind of godlike power given to human beings. And even though Zeus is essentially called a tyrant, that his rule is a tyranny, according to power, Prometheus just has to get used to it. He's overly fond of these mortals that inhabit the same cosmos, and he's kind of endangered everyone by bestowing on them gifts that are reserved for the gods, things like creativity and intellect and invention. Now, of course, Prometheus himself has a very different view of the matter. He says, I say nothing, but don't think that means I'm arrogant or stubborn. I see myself abused, bullied. So he sees himself very much a victim of Zeus's authoritarian rule. Brooding eats my heart away. After all, who apportioned the privileges among these latter-day gods? Who but I? So he's implying that the gods of the current regime kind of owe him something. Now later in the play, another figure arrives, a young woman named Io. She's one of Zeus's love interests, who's being perpetually tormented by a gadfly, which causes her to wander the earth endlessly. And she comes upon Prometheus as he is, fastened to the mountain at the edge of the earth. And she laments the degree of suffering that she has undergone at the hands of Zeus, king of the gods. And Prometheus tells her, he says, you would find it hard to bear these trials of mine, since for me death is not decreed at all. And this is a kind of common trope in ancient Greek literature that, yes, the gods are immortal, but they're almost envious of the mortality of human beings, because if everything boils down to suffering, as we saw, in an earlier passage we looked at, death brings that suffering to an end. But a god who is suffering cannot die, so potentially Prometheus's suffering could go on endlessly. But Prometheus, he's also a god of prophecy. In fact, his name has to do with the notion of forethought. So he says to Io, death would indeed be a riddance of my suffering, but as it is, there is no limit set for pain, save when Zeus falls from his seat of power. So this is a very important prophecy that Prometheus communicates here, that Zeus's rule is not forever. There were other divine rulers before him. They were overthrown. It's entirely likely that Zeus will someday be brought down from his seat of power. So in that case, Prometheus has some hope that his suffering will come to an end. So as much as Zeus was seen as this important patriarchal figure, as king of the gods, and there was a lot of effort spent honoring Zeus and performing sacrifices and festivals to, appease him. There was some kind of criticism that we find in the literary tradition that pointed out the kind of negative side of his rule in terms of his cruelty and his anger and his arbitrary decisions. But again, there was some kind of glimmer of distant hope that the cruelty of Zeus might someday and when his regime is overthrown at some future point. So we'll continue exploring some themes that we draw out of this notion of Zeus and Hera in part 2 of this module.